In the heart of Miami's vibrant Latin community, the Rivera family stood as a beacon of success and tradition. Their family-owned grocery chain was a staple of the neighborhood, providing not just food but a sense of unity and stability. It was a family that, to the outside world, seemed flawless, exuding the image of hard work, faith, and devotion to community. Yet, behind the polished exterior of their business and home, cracks were beginning to form. Isabella Rivera, the matriarch of the family, was everything the community admired. With her long, dark hair and radiant smile, she seemed to embody the perfect Christian wife and mother. Every Sunday, she sat in the front pew of St. Mark's Church, her eyes closed in prayer, surrounded by her children Lena and Nico, her husband Victor at her side. She was the epitome of grace, quiet, patient, and always attentive to the needs of her family. Her house, nestled in the quieter corners of Miami, was a reflection of the life she had carefully cultivated, neat, organized, filled with the smells of fresh bread and home-cooked meals. Victor Rivera, her husband, was a different sort of man. Strong-willed, driven, and fiercely dedicated to the family business, he was the unquestioned leader of the household. His days were consumed by meetings with suppliers, managing the stores, and making sure the family legacy lived on. But as the years passed, his eyes seemed less focused on his family and more on the bottom line. His long hours at the store, his increasing distance from Isabella, and his disinterest in their home life slowly began to erode the warmth that once defined their relationship. In the early years of their marriage, Victor had been everything Isabella needed: supportive, loving, a partner who shared her dreams. But now, in 2015, that warmth had long faded into routine. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared plans, were reduced to terse exchanges about bills, the children's school activities, and the never-ending cycle of work. Isabella, who had once felt cherished and admired by Victor, now sat in their large house, alone in her thoughts, watching as the life she had built seemed to slip away. Their children, Lena and Nico, were growing up fast, but even they couldn't fill the void. Lena, now 16, was focused on her studies and trying to make sense of the growing tension at home. Nico, only 12, was blissfully unaware of the cracks forming between his parents, his world still full of innocence and wonder. In a life where faith and family were supposed to keep them grounded, Isabella began to feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her. The long hours Victor spent at work, the coldness that had come to define their relationship, left her starved for attention, for connection. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Her heart longed for something more, someone who could see her, truly see her, in a way Victor no longer could. And so, when Carlos Rivera, Victor's father, started visiting more frequently, she found herself drawn to him. Carlos, at 65, had retired from the daily grind of the business and stepped into a role of spiritual leader within the community. A man of deep faith, respected by all, he had become a pillar of wisdom and guidance for those around him. But even in his quiet strength, Isabella noticed a deep sadness in him, a sorrow that mirrored her own. Carlos, who had lost his beloved wife years earlier, seemed to understand the loneliness that had begun to consume her. Their initial conversations were innocent enough. A few words after church, a chat during family gatherings. But soon, their interactions began to shift. Carlos, always attentive, listened with empathy as Isabella opened up about the loneliness she felt in her marriage. His presence, comforting and steady, was a balm to her wounds. And soon, those conversations became the highlight of her days. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the moments when they could share their mutual grief, their yearning for something more than the lives they were leading. Isabella knew she was walking a fine line, but the temptation was too great. She couldn't help but notice the way Carlos looked at her, the softening of his expression when they spoke, the way his hand brushed hers ever so slightly, as though he too were drawn to something deeper. In the quiet moments, when they were alone, Isabella could feel the weight of his unspoken desire. She told herself it was harmless. After all, he was a man of God, a father-in-law who had always treated her like a daughter. But beneath the surface, something else was stirring, something dangerous. The story of Isabella and Carlos had only just begun, but the seeds of something far more complex were already being sown. What started as a search for solace would soon spiral into a web of manipulation, betrayal, and dark secrets that would tear their family apart. And as the days passed, the lines between right and wrong began to blur, and Isabella found herself on a path that would change everything. By 2016, the once harmonious household of the Riveras had become a battlefield of unspoken tensions and hidden resentments. Isabella's yearning for emotional connection had only deepened with time, while Victor, consumed by his growing business empire, seemed oblivious to the cracks appearing in their marriage. The warm, loving conversations they had once shared were now reduced to passing pleasantries, and the love that once defined their relationship was all but gone. Victor's days became longer, his presence at home shorter, and when he was there, he was lost in thought, his mind elsewhere, on the stores, the suppliers, the numbers. He no longer saw the weariness in Isabella's eyes, nor the quiet ache in her heart. The once passionate discussions about their dreams had turned into sterile, obligatory talks about the household budget, upcoming work schedules, and the children's school events. Isabella had become nothing more than a shadow in the background of Victor's busy life. Isabella, for her part, tried to keep the facade intact, clinging to the role of the perfect wife and mother. She attended every community event, hosted dinners, and kept up appearances, outwardly the ideal matriarch. But inside, she was crumbling. The loneliness she felt in her marriage was growing unbearable, and no amount of time spent with her children, Lena and Nico, could fill the emptiness. Lena, at 16, was busy with her own life, her schoolwork, and burgeoning friendships, while Nico, at 12, was still young enough to remain largely untouched by the shifting dynamics of their home. Isabella could not help but feel as though the family she had worked so hard to build was slipping through her fingers, bit by bit. It was during this time of growing emotional distance that Carlos started visiting more frequently. Initially, his visits were simply out of a desire to spend time with his son, Victor, and to offer guidance on the business. But as the months passed, his presence became a comforting constant in Isabella's life. What had started as casual conversations about family matters slowly morphed into deeper exchanges about her feelings of isolation, her frustrations with Victor, and the quiet despair that had begun to cloud her every day. Carlos listened with patience, his gentle demeanor offering the solace Isabella had longed for. He spoke of his own loneliness after his wife's death, how the world seemed to change once she was gone, and how he had come to rely on faith to cope with the void she had left. In his words, Isabella found understanding, something she hadn't experienced in years. And for the first time in a long while, she felt seen, heard. It wasn't long before those moments of solace became something more. Carlos, ever the compassionate listener, began offering Isabella more than just comfort. He began to provide the attention she had desperately missed from Victor. He would linger after family dinners, offering his company when Victor was absent, and Isabella, no longer content to live in the emptiness of her marriage, began to look forward to these private moments with him. Their bond, once founded on simple conversation, became laden with unspoken tension. Isabella, though still holding on to her commitment to Victor, could not deny the growing pull she felt toward Carlos. His presence stirred something in her, something long dormant. As the year wore on, Carlos's visits to the Rivera household became more frequent, always under the pretense of helping out with the business or spending time with his grandchildren. But behind closed doors, the lines between family duty and forbidden desire blurred. Isabella began to relish these moments, the way Carlos's eyes would soften when they spoke, the way his voice would lower in a quiet intimacy, making her feel as though she was the most important person in the room. For the first time in years, Isabella felt desired, not as a wife or mother, but as a woman. And it was intoxicating. Carlos, too, began to notice the change in their dynamic. What had started as a paternal affection for his daughter-in-law gradually deepened into something else, something more dangerous. He had always admired Isabella for her devotion to her family, her grace, and the way she managed everything so effortlessly. But now, as he watched her grow more distant from Victor, he saw the cracks in her facade, the loneliness that lay beneath the surface. He began to sense that she needed something more than what Victor could offer, something that, perhaps, he could provide. The guilt that had initially held him back slowly faded as he, too, became entangled in the growing connection between them. In these moments, when they were alone, the boundaries that should have existed between father-in-law and daughter-in-law began to blur. Isabella was no longer just Victor's wife. She was a woman struggling to reconcile her desires with her responsibilities, torn between her loyalty to her husband and the undeniable pull she felt toward Carlos. She would speak of her longing for affection, the desire to feel loved and appreciated, and Carlos, ever the listener, would offer words of comfort, subtly reinforcing the idea that she deserved more. He would tell her that she was beautiful, that she was worth more than the life she had. Slowly, these words began to erode the walls Isabella had built around her heart, and the once distant father-in-law began to seem like the answer to all the questions she had been too afraid to ask. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but undeniable. By the fall of 2016, Isabella and Carlos had crossed the line from mere emotional connection to something darker. Their bond had shifted from one of shared grief and understanding to something far more intimate. What had once been innocent moments of companionship had evolved into stolen glances, lingering touches, and, eventually, passionate encounters. Victor remained oblivious, lost in his work and his own troubles, blind to the changes unfolding within his own home. The cracks in his marriage were invisible to him, as he focused all his energy on maintaining the success of his business. His neglect of Isabella had opened the door for Carlos, and Isabella, caught between her duties as a wife and the intoxicating allure of her father-in-law, was no longer sure which way to turn. The family that had once seemed so perfect, so strong, was now a house of secrets, where love and loyalty had given way to manipulation and betrayal. What had begun as a small crack in the surface was now a deep chasm, threatening to tear apart everything Isabella had worked so hard to build. This section delves deeper into the emotional turmoil that Isabella faces as her relationship with Victor crumbles, and the slow but undeniable development of her connection with Carlos. The family dynamic, once filled with love and unity, begins to unravel, setting the stage for the darker events to come. As the months passed into 2017, Isabella found herself living in a constant state of internal conflict. The relationship between her and Carlos had evolved from innocent conversation to something far more complex, something she couldn't easily dismiss. What had begun as a search for solace had turned into a tangled web of emotions, desires, and guilt, a dangerous dance that seemed to have no end. And yet, every moment with Carlos felt like an escape, a brief respite from the cold reality of her marriage and the ever-deepening loneliness that haunted her. Carlos, too, was becoming increasingly entangled in their bond. At first, he had offered Isabella compassion, and their shared grief had brought them closer together. He had been a father figure to her, a steady presence in her life that provided the emotional support Victor had failed to give. But over time, Carlos began to see Isabella not just as his daughter-in-law but as a woman, his woman. The guilt that had once held him back began to erode, replaced by something stronger, a deep, unsettling desire that he could no longer deny. Every time Carlos visited, he could feel the tension between them intensifying. The glances they shared, the brief touches, the unspoken words hanging in the air, each moment felt charged with a dangerous energy. He had become aware of the power he held over her, the way she looked at him with longing, the way her body seemed to draw closer to his whenever they were alone. Carlos, a man who had once been revered for his wisdom and faith, now found himself in the grips of something he couldn't control. He had always believed in the sanctity of family, in the importance of loyalty, but now he was torn between that belief and the overwhelming need he felt for Isabella. One evening, after dinner, when Victor had stayed late at the store, Carlos lingered behind in the living room, as he had done so many times before. Isabella sat beside him, her hand resting near his. Their conversations had become more personal, more intimate. They spoke of their regrets, their unfulfilled desires, their need for something beyond what they had. Carlos had grown to understand the depths of Isabella's pain, the years of feeling neglected, of being an afterthought in her husband's life. And as he listened to her, he felt a swell of sympathy that soon turned into something darker. "I've always tried to be everything he wanted," Isabella confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it feels like I'm invisible to him. Like I'm not enough." Her eyes met his, filled with an unspoken vulnerability that Carlos had never seen before. His heart ached, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the woman before him not as a daughter-in-law, but as a lost soul, someone who had been starved for love and attention. Carlos knew, deep down, that what they were doing was wrong, but he couldn't stop. His desire for her had taken root in a way that no amount of rational thinking could undo. It was as though the weight of their shared secrets, their unspoken bond, had made their connection inevitable. When Isabella leaned in closer, their breaths mingling in the dim light of the room, Carlos felt his resolve crumble. He could no longer pretend that this was just about comfort or empathy. The lines between right and wrong had long since blurred, and what remained was a dangerous game of power, manipulation, and forbidden desire. In a quiet, unspoken moment, Isabella placed her hand on his, the simple touch sending a jolt of electricity through both of them. Her fingers traced over his skin slowly, as though testing the waters, and Carlos found himself unable to pull away. He had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to maintain control, but in that moment, with Isabella so close, he was no longer the man who had led his family with honor. He was a man consumed by the very thing he had once preached against, temptation. And then, it happened. Without a word, without a single protest from either of them, Carlos leaned in. His lips brushed against hers, tentative at first, as though testing the limits of what they could do, what they could feel. Isabella, for a brief moment, hesitated, but then, as if surrendering to the longing she had kept hidden for so long, she kissed him back. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the rush of emotions, the frantic desire that had been building between them for months. In that moment, there was no guilt, no family, no moral compass, there was only the heat of the kiss, the undeniable connection that had bridged the gap between father-in-law and daughter-in-law. Afterward, when the kiss ended and the room fell silent, they both remained still, as though afraid to break the moment. Isabella, breathing heavily, looked into Carlos's eyes, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and satisfaction. Carlos's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't just the physical desire that weighed on him. It was the overwhelming realization that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no going back now. They both knew that what had just happened would change everything, perhaps forever. And yet, as they sat there, staring at one another in the quiet aftermath, neither of them could bring themselves to say a word. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface had finally exploded, and now, there was no pretending that things could go back to the way they had been. Isabella stood up, her mind racing. She knew the consequences of what they had done, the devastation it could bring to her family. But at that moment, the pull toward Carlos was too strong, and the thought of returning to her empty marriage with Victor seemed unbearable. Carlos, too, felt the weight of the decision they had made, but his desire for her was overpowering. They were no longer just two people caught in a web of manipulation and need, they had become two people bound together by something deeper, something more dangerous than either of them could fully understand. As Isabella turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder at Carlos, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. And though they both knew they had crossed a line that night, neither of them could foresee the destruction that lay ahead. The tangled relationship between them had only just begun, and the consequences of their actions would soon unravel in ways neither of them could imagine. This section explores the growing complexity of Isabella and Carlos's relationship. The emotional and physical connection they share deepens, setting the stage for the intense consequences of their actions. The tension between moral responsibility and forbidden desire pushes both characters toward a point of no return. By the summer of 2018, the relationship between Isabella and Carlos had crossed a dangerous threshold, one from which there was no returning. What began as an innocent connection built on shared loneliness had morphed into something far darker, a complex web of psychological manipulation, deceit, and control. Isabella, once the doting wife of Victor, was now a woman transformed, wielding the power she had once sought for in the quietest corners of her marriage. But it came at a price, one that would cost her not only her family but her very soul. Isabella had long been dissatisfied with her marriage to Victor. The years of emotional neglect, the long hours spent apart, and the sense of invisibility had slowly chipped away at her. But it wasn't until her emotional dependence on Carlos deepened that she realized how much power she could gain from the situation. It wasn't love that fueled her actions, it was control, an insatiable need to take charge of her own life, to feel valued, and to be desired by someone other than Victor. And Carlos, with his deep sense of guilt and his years of vulnerability, became the perfect pawn in her game. Carlos had fallen into a spiral of guilt and desire. He had convinced himself that he was only trying to comfort Isabella, that his actions were justifiable by her pain and need for affection. But as time went on, he could no longer ignore the fact that his feelings for her were no longer fatherly, they were romantic, even obsessive. Every visit, every touch, every look fueled his internal conflict. He had tried to rationalize his actions, telling himself that Isabella had been the one to initiate their intimacy, that she, too, was complicit in their relationship. But deep down, he knew that he was no longer the man he had once been. The power dynamic had shifted. Isabella had manipulated him in ways that went beyond physical attraction. She had preyed on his emotions, his loneliness, and his sense of moral weakness. Isabella, fully aware of Carlos's inner turmoil, began to exploit his feelings to her advantage. She knew exactly how to push his buttons, how to feed into his guilt, how to make him feel needed. Every time Carlos expressed doubt or guilt, Isabella would remind him of the loneliness they both shared, of the fact that Victor was neglecting her, of the fact that Carlos had always been a strong, supportive father figure but had never been truly seen for who he was. She would speak in soft, sympathetic tones, playing the part of the vulnerable woman, helpless in the face of her own emotions. "You know I'm not asking for much, Carlos," she would say, her voice dripping with sincerity. "Just someone to see me, to care for me the way I deserve." Her manipulation was subtle, like a slow, creeping vine that wound its way around Carlos's heart and mind, leaving him unable to break free. Whenever he expressed hesitation, whenever he tried to pull away, Isabella would press harder, using guilt and fear to reel him back in. She would remind him of the bond they shared, how they both understood each other in ways no one else could. She would tell him that what they had wasn't just an affair, it was a destiny, a connection that couldn't be broken. And slowly, Carlos began to believe her. Isabella's tactics were brilliant in their simplicity. She understood that Carlos was a man of faith, a man who had lived his life according to principles of right and wrong. And so, she played to those principles, twisting them to fit her narrative. She spoke of fate, of how their union was meant to be, as though their actions were part of some divine plan. She even used his own guilt against him, making him believe that their secret relationship was somehow redemptive, that by loving her, by giving her the affection she so desperately needed, he was helping to heal both of them. It was a lie, but it was one Carlos wanted to believe, and Isabella knew it. With each passing day, Carlos's resistance weakened. He became more and more entangled in Isabella's web of manipulation. She had made him believe that she was the only person who truly understood him, that their connection was unique and irreplaceable. She convinced him that Victor's indifference toward her made her an easy victim of loneliness, and that it was his duty, no, his privilege, to give her the love she had been denied. But it wasn't just emotional manipulation that Isabella employed. She also knew how to play on Carlos's physical desires. When they were alone, she would gently touch him, her hands lingering just a little too long. She would smile softly, making sure to maintain eye contact, and her words would be laced with double meanings. "You know, Carlos," she would say, her voice low and soothing, "it's hard to feel loved when no one even notices you." Her subtle flirtations, her careful positioning, made it impossible for Carlos to ignore the magnetic pull between them. The lines between guilt and desire were blurred, and as much as he fought it, he found himself drawn deeper into the affair. Isabella, too, began to relish her newfound power. She had the ability to shape Carlos's emotions, to make him see her as the center of his world. In her mind, she had become the one thing he couldn't live without. She reveled in the control she held over him, watching him crumble beneath the weight of his own guilt and desire. To her, it wasn't about love, it was about domination, about making Carlos believe that she was the only one who could save him from his loneliness, just as he was the only one who could save her from hers. She was the architect of his misery, and yet, she convinced him that she was his salvation. The power imbalance between them grew more pronounced as time went on. Isabella knew that Carlos, despite his attempts to justify his actions, could never truly escape the hold she had over him. And Carlos, blinded by his emotions and Isabella's manipulation, was too deep into the affair to see the damage he was causing, not only to his own soul, but to the very fabric of the Rivera family. The deeper they fell into their entanglement, the harder it became for either of them to find a way out. The web had been woven, and now they were both caught in it, two people unable to break free, bound by a web of manipulation, lies, and an all-consuming desire. What they didn't realize, however, was that the consequences of their actions would soon come crashing down on them, and the lives they had known would be shattered forever. As the year wore on, the pressure within Isabella grew unbearable. The affair with Carlos had already consumed her life, filling her with an intoxicating sense of power and control. But even more than the affair, what truly began to dominate her thoughts was the unrelenting desire to rid herself of Victor, her husband, the man she had once loved, who had become nothing more than a stranger to her. The affair with Carlos, though deeply entangled with guilt and moral conflict, offered her an escape, but it was also a reminder of what she had sacrificed in her marriage to Victor. Victor's increasing neglect and distance had made it clear to Isabella that he was no longer emotionally present in their marriage. His obsession with the family business had consumed him entirely. The once vibrant man who had been her partner in everything now seemed a mere shadow of his former self. The long hours he spent working, the late-night meetings, the constant focus on the business had turned their home into a hollow shell. Isabella, who had once hoped to rebuild their connection, now saw him as a mere obstacle, something standing in the way of her happiness. She wanted him gone, not just emotionally but physically, so she could start fresh with Carlos, without the guilt or the weight of the life she had built with Victor. Isabella began to plant the seeds of this dark plan in Carlos's mind. She subtly nudged him, speaking more often of how Victor's indifference made her feel suffocated and trapped in a marriage that had long since died. She painted a picture of a life with Carlos, a life where there was no more hiding, no more pretending. But there was one problem: Victor was still alive. Every conversation between them began to take on a darker, more twisted tone. Carlos, torn by his growing feelings for Isabella and his guilt over their affair, found himself wavering between moral duty and his own desires. Isabella, ever the manipulator, played on this, using his guilt to her advantage. She knew how to frame their situation, how to convince Carlos that the only way for them to be truly happy, to truly be free, was to remove the one obstacle left standing in their way, Victor. "You know, Carlos," Isabella said one night, her voice soft but laced with urgency, "if Victor were out of the picture, things would be so much easier. No more pretending, no more lies. We could finally be who we truly are, without the weight of his neglect hanging over us." Carlos, his face a mixture of guilt and desire, looked at her. He felt the weight of her words, and as much as he wanted to believe that they could find a way to be together without tragedy, he couldn't shake the nagging fear in his chest. But Isabella was relentless, weaving her web of manipulation. She reminded him how much they both deserved to be happy, how Victor's cruelty had torn her apart, and how they deserved freedom. She played on Carlos's deepest fears and desires, the desire for closeness, for intimacy, for redemption. She fed him the lie that killing Victor wasn't just necessary, it was divine justice. The more Carlos hesitated, the more Isabella's subtle push grew. She planted seeds of doubt, making him believe that Victor would never change, that he would never truly see her for the woman she was. "Victor is blind to everything, Carlos," she whispered one evening, her hand resting on his. "He'll never appreciate what we have, what we could have. The only way to free us from this hell is for him to be gone." And so, in the quietest moments, the darkest whispers, the idea began to take root. The plan was set into motion, carefully, deliberately. Isabella and Carlos both knew what had to be done, and the more they spoke of it, the less doubt lingered. They convinced themselves that this was the only way to a future together, a future unburdened by guilt, by shame, by the weight of a marriage that had long since soured. By March of 2019, the plan had become a clear path, its end no longer just a possibility but an inevitability. Victor's days were numbered, and the cold, clinical nature of their plotting seemed almost too easy. Isabella knew the layout of the house better than anyone, and she had a perfect understanding of Victor's routine. He would be working late, she knew. He would be in the garage, doing some maintenance work on one of the cars. It was a perfect opportunity, one that couldn't be wasted. They discussed every detail with chilling precision, the timing, the method, the way to ensure no one would suspect anything. Carlos would strike, Isabella would play her role as the grieving widow, and the life they both dreamed of would finally be within reach. On the night of March 6, 2019, the plan was executed with chilling precision. Victor had stayed late at the store, as he often did. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hall. Isabella knew this was her chance. She watched as Carlos slipped out of the house, headed toward the garage where Victor was tinkering with one of the cars. She felt no fear, no remorse, only a cold certainty. This was what needed to be done. Carlos approached Victor from behind, holding a heavy wrench he had taken from the garage toolbox. The noise of the car engine and the whirring of tools drowned out the sound of footsteps. Victor never saw it coming. With one swift motion, Carlos raised the wrench and brought it down onto Victor's head, the force of the blow sending a sickening crack through the air. Victor crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless before it even had a chance to react. Isabella, who had been watching from the window, felt a strange sense of triumph wash over her. She had done it. She had freed herself. The plan was complete, and soon, Carlos would be the only one left in her life. She rushed outside, kneeling beside Victor's lifeless body, her hand touching his blood-soaked shirt. She called the police, her voice trembling with the right amount of panic, the perfect amount of grief. By the time the police arrived, Isabella was already in character, grieving, confused, helpless. She told them how Victor had been working in the garage late, and how she had gone to check on him only to find him dead. She played the part of the widow, the devastated wife, flawlessly. But the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. Isabella and Carlos had planned the murder with meticulous care, each step designed to cover their tracks. As the police investigated, they would soon begin to uncover the layers of deception, the lies that had been spun, and the betrayal that had torn the Rivera family apart. The crime had been executed, and though the aftermath had only just begun, Isabella was certain of one thing: her life with Carlos was finally within reach. Underscore 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 This section of the story details the methodical planning and execution of Victor's murder, highlighting the chilling precision of Isabella and Carlos's actions. The manipulation, psychological control, and sense of inevitability have led them to this dark moment, and now the consequences of their decisions will begin to unravel. The cold air of March 6, 2019, hung heavily around the Rivera house as the police arrived, lights flashing, sirens wailing. It was a scene of chaos, a scene that Isabella had orchestrated with chilling precision. She sat on the front steps, her hands trembling in her lap, her face twisted in grief as she watched the officers sweep through the house. Her heart raced, but she made sure to keep her composure. This was her moment to shine, to perform the role she had so carefully constructed in the hours leading up to Victor's death. "I don't understand, officer," Isabella said, her voice cracking with feigned despair as she spoke to the detective who had approached her. "He was just here, just moments ago. He was working in the garage, and when I came to check on him, I found him, like that." Detective Luis Herrera, a seasoned officer known for his methodical approach, took note of Isabella's performance. Her reaction, while fitting the role of a grieving widow, struck him as somewhat controlled, too controlled. There was a level of calmness in her eyes that didn't match the devastation she was supposedly feeling. Still, he had seen families in shock, people acting in strange ways after trauma. He made a mental note but dismissed it for the time being, focusing instead on the scene in front of him. The garage was a gruesome sight. Blood spattered across the concrete, staining the once peaceful space where Victor had worked on his projects. The air in the garage was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and Victor's body lay motionless, his head battered by a single, brutal blow from a heavy wrench. His eyes were wide open in death, staring blankly at the ceiling as if caught in the moment of his last breath. The murder was swift, efficient. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign that Victor had seen the blow coming. The initial thoughts of the police team were that this could have been a robbery gone wrong. But as the investigation unfolded, it quickly became clear that this was no random act. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing. The family's possessions, their valuables, remained untouched. The idea of a botched robbery faded as the brutality of the crime and the precision of the attack became clearer. This was personal. Someone close to Victor had been involved. Isabella's story remained consistent throughout the initial questioning. She described how she had gone to bed early, unaware of anything unusual. She told them that Victor had been working late, something he often did when he was focused on his business. She explained how she had found him dead when she went to check on him. It was a perfect narrative, too perfect, perhaps. Detective Herrera listened intently, making notes of the details. But there was something about Isabella's demeanor that nagged at him. She was calm, almost unnervingly so. Her tears, though genuine in appearance, didn't reach her eyes. He had seen this before, a subtle, almost imperceptible difference in the way people grieved, something that spoke of a rehearsed performance. His instincts told him that there was more to this than met the eye. The investigation continued through the night, with officers combing through the house for clues. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. In a closet, tucked away behind a stack of old clothes, one of the officers discovered a hidden cell phone. It was an older model, one that hadn't been used in months, but as soon as the phone was unlocked, its contents sent shockwaves through the investigation. The phone revealed a series of explicit text messages between Isabella and Carlos, their language graphic and filled with innuendo. The messages painted a picture of a clandestine affair, a relationship that had escalated far beyond mere emotional comfort. But it wasn't just the affair that stood out, it was the chilling way they discussed Victor's death. The messages hinted at plans, carefully laid out with dates and times, details that matched the timeline of the murder with disturbing precision. Isabella's denial of any involvement in the murder began to crumble as the police put the pieces together. The texts revealed how she had manipulated Carlos, feeding into his emotions and guilt, convincing him that removing Victor from the picture was not just a solution, but a form of redemption, a way to escape their shared guilt. The messages laid bare her control over Carlos, showing how she had used his loneliness, his desire for her, to manipulate him into committing the unthinkable. The police didn't confront Isabella immediately. They needed time to process the information they had uncovered and to plan their next move. Detective Herrera knew that if they confronted her too soon, she might close ranks, and any chance of getting the full truth would slip away. But the evidence was clear, and as the days passed, they gathered more, piecing together the full scope of the crime. Isabella's involvement was undeniable. Her fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, and the text messages provided irrefutable proof of her role in orchestrating the murder. Finally, on March 8, 2019, Detective Herrera brought Isabella in for questioning again. This time, he was prepared. As he sat across from her in the sterile interrogation room, the weight of the evidence behind him, Isabella's calmness began to slip. The facade she had so carefully built began to crack under the pressure of the truth. "You're not fooling anyone, Isabella," Detective Herrera said, his voice low but firm. "We found the phone. We saw the messages. We know what happened that night." Isabella's face tightened, but she said nothing. Her lips trembled slightly, but she remained silent, her eyes downcast. "You planned it, didn't you?" Herrera pressed. "You convinced Carlos to kill Victor. You manipulated him every step of the way. And now you think you can walk away from this?" Isabella's composure shattered. For the first time since the murder, she looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. "Victor was nothing to me anymore. He was a ghost, a man who didn't even see me. He didn't deserve to live." The confession, though not full, was damning enough. Isabella's involvement was clear, and the police knew they had enough to charge both her and Carlos with murder. Isabella had orchestrated it all, using her charm, her control, and her understanding of Carlos's vulnerability to manipulate him into committing the ultimate betrayal. The truth had finally been uncovered, but it came at a heavy cost. The Rivera family, once the epitome of success and faith in the community, had been torn apart by lies, manipulation, and betrayal. And as Isabella sat there in the interrogation room, the weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. There was no escaping the consequences now. The life she had built, the control she had so carefully crafted, was unraveling, piece by piece. Underscore 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 underscore. This section of the story focuses on the investigation that follows Victor's murder, the gradual unraveling of Isabella's perfect narrative, and the discovery of the incriminating evidence that exposes her role in the crime. Detective Herrera's growing suspicions and the eventual confrontation with Isabella highlight the psychological tension and the complexity of her manipulation. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, is now coming to light, and Isabella's carefully constructed facade is beginning to crumble. By the time the Rivera case reached the courtroom in early 2020, the entire neighborhood had been rocked to its core. The once admired family, the epitome of faith, devotion, and success, had been torn apart by the shocking betrayal of Isabella and Carlos. What was supposed to be a close-knit, respected family had now become the subject of whispered gossip, judgment, and media frenzy. News outlets across Miami had covered the case extensively, turning it into a spectacle. Isabella, the beloved wife and mother, had been exposed as the mastermind behind her husband's brutal murder, and Carlos, her own father-in-law, was now facing charges for carrying out the crime. The trial began on a crisp morning in January 2020, and the courtroom was packed. Members of the community, former friends, and family of the Riveras filled the benches, eager to witness the downfall of the once revered family. The air was thick with tension, and a sense of disbelief hung over the proceedings. How could someone who had been a pillar of the community, someone so devoted to faith and family, betray those closest to her in such a cold, calculating manner? As the prosecution laid out its case, the evidence against Isabella and Carlos seemed overwhelming. The text messages found on the hidden phone, detailing their affair and plotting the murder, were read aloud in court. The chilling precision with which they had planned Victor's death was revealed. Every detail, from the time of day to the method used, had been carefully considered. Isabella's manipulation of Carlos was made painfully clear. She had preyed on his guilt, his loneliness, and his emotional vulnerability to control him, convincing him that the murder was not only necessary but justified. The text messages painted a picture of a woman who was not just unhappy in her marriage but obsessed with power, control, and escaping a life that no longer satisfied her. The defense, however, argued that Carlos had acted out of love for Isabella, that he had been manipulated into committing the crime by her emotional manipulation. They claimed that Carlos, being a man of faith and morals, could never have done such a thing on his own without being convinced by Isabella that it was the right course of action. The defense painted Isabella as a victim of her own circumstances, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who had been led astray by the emotional isolation that Victor had imposed on her. But even their best efforts to portray Isabella as a woman scorned fell flat in the face of the damning evidence. Throughout the trial, Isabella remained calm and composed. She sat at the defendant's table, her eyes occasionally meeting those of the jury, but she showed no visible signs of remorse. Her stoic demeanor only fueled the perception that she was cold, calculating, and unfeeling. When it was her turn to testify, she spoke in a calm, controlled voice, recounting the details of her marriage to Victor and the emotional neglect she had suffered. She spoke of how she had felt invisible in her marriage, how Victor's obsession with his work had left her starved for attention and affection. But her words rang hollow. The jury could not ignore the fact that, rather than seek help or open communication with her husband, Isabella had instead resorted to manipulation, deceit, and ultimately murder. "I did what I had to do," Isabella said, her voice steady, but her words haunting. "Victor was not the man I married. He became distant, uncaring. I needed someone to see me, to love me. I couldn't live in a marriage that was suffocating me. I couldn't keep living in a lie." Her words were met with a cold silence from the courtroom. The prosecutor countered, asking her why, if her marriage had deteriorated, she didn't seek help, why she didn't speak to Victor or seek a divorce. Why, instead, had she chosen to have an affair with her father-in-law and manipulate him into killing her husband? In the end, Isabella's calmness, her ability to articulate her feelings with precision, only made her guilt more apparent. The lack of emotion she showed, even when recounting the brutal death of her husband, painted a picture of a woman who had orchestrated the murder with a chilling lack of remorse. She had become a master of manipulation, using every tool at her disposal, her beauty, her charm, her emotional vulnerability, to get what she wanted, regardless of the cost. The trial reached its conclusion, and the jury deliberated for several days. When they returned with their verdict, there was little surprise among those who had followed the case. Isabella was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read aloud. Isabella's face remained unchanged, though a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps disbelief, passed through her eyes. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carlos, meanwhile, was convicted of second-degree murder. His role in the crime was undeniable, but his emotional manipulation by Isabella had been a key part of his defense. The judge, taking into account his age and the fact that he had been manipulated by his own daughter-in-law, sentenced him to 25 years in prison. The Rivera family was shattered beyond repair. Lena, now 18, had to come to terms with the fact that her mother had orchestrated the murder of her father. Nico, still only 14, couldn't understand why his world had been turned upside down. The family business, once the pride of the Riveras, struggled to survive without Victor's leadership, and many customers who had once trusted the Rivera name began to pull away. The community, which had once held the Riveras in high regard, now saw them as pariahs, victims of their own hubris and betrayal. As Isabella was led away in handcuffs, her face betraying little emotion, she glanced one last time at the courtroom. She had spent so many years manipulating those around her to get what she wanted. Now, as she faced the consequences of her actions, there was no escape. The life she had so carefully built, the web of lies and deceit, had finally unraveled. The family she had destroyed could never be rebuilt, and the love she had sought, the freedom she had craved, was now lost to her forever. Isabella had thought that by taking control of her life, she could escape the suffocating world of her marriage and build a new one with Carlos. But in the end, she had destroyed everything: her family, her community, and herself. The price of her desire for control had been far higher than she could ever have imagined. This section delves into the emotional and psychological fallout of the trial, highlighting Isabella's manipulation of the justice system, the defense arguments, and the final consequences of her actions. The courtroom drama unfolds with a sense of inevitability as the Riveras face the repercussions of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. Isabella's stoic demeanor and lack of remorse add to the chilling nature of her crime, and the lasting effects on her family and community are felt deeply. The verdicts were rendered, but the consequences of Isabella and Carlos's actions were far from over. The trial had ended, but the fallout from the crime continued to ripple through the lives of everyone involved. The Rivera family, once a shining example of success, faith, and unity in their community, had been shattered beyond repair. The very foundation of their lives had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. What had seemed like a perfect life was now reduced to a series of painful memories, guilt, and the realization that things could never be the same. Lena, at 18, had to come to terms with the fact that her mother, the woman she had trusted and admired, was responsible for her father's death. The news of Isabella's conviction hit Lena hard. She had spent years believing in the image of the perfect family, but now, the truth had shattered that illusion. Lena's grief wasn't just for her father, but for the betrayal she felt from the one person who should have been her protector. It was a pain that would stay with her for the rest of her life, and no amount of time or distance could ever heal the wound her mother had caused. Nico, at just 14 years old, was caught in a whirlwind of confusion. He couldn't fully comprehend the depth of what had happened, but he knew enough to understand that his world had been torn apart. His father was dead, and his mother was now behind bars. The loss of both parents in such a devastating way left Nico grappling with feelings of abandonment and a deep sense of betrayal. His life, which should have been filled with the simple joys of childhood, had been irrevocably altered. And as he grew older, he would carry the burden of a shattered family, a legacy of destruction that had been set in motion by the very people who should have loved and protected him. The community, once so proud of the Riveras, was left to pick up the pieces as well. The family business, which had once been the backbone of the Rivera name, began to suffer. Customers who had trusted the Riveras for years began to pull away. The grocery stores, once a symbol of success, became a reminder of the tragic downfall of a family that had once been revered. The trust that the Riveras had built with their community was irreparably broken. The legacy of the family business was tainted by the dark secrets that had been exposed in the courtroom. Even the church, where Carlos had once been a respected elder, felt the weight of the scandal. His role as a spiritual leader had given him a sense of authority and respect, but now, with the truth of his involvement in the murder, that reputation was shattered. He had once been seen as a man of wisdom and guidance, but now he was a man marked by sin and shame. His actions had not only destroyed his own family, but also the faith that so many had placed in him. The church, which had once been a sanctuary for many, now had to reckon with the fact that one of its own had fallen from grace in the most tragic of ways. For Isabella, the consequences were far-reaching and irreversible. She had spent years manipulating those around her, using her charm and control to shape the world according to her desires. But in the end, all she had built came crashing down. She had convinced herself that she was justified in her actions, that she was a victim of circumstance, that she deserved more than the life she had. But the truth was that her manipulations had destroyed everything she claimed to love. Her family, her reputation, and her future had all been sacrificed in the pursuit of her own selfish desires. And now, sitting in a prison cell, she was left to reflect on the choices she had made and the irreversible damage they had caused. The lessons from Isabella and Carlos's story are as profound as they are tragic. At the heart of their actions was a deep sense of dissatisfaction and unfulfilled desires. But rather than seek healthy solutions or face the pain in their lives, they chose to manipulate and deceive. Isabella used her emotional vulnerability to control Carlos, turning him into a pawn in her game. And in doing so, they both became trapped in a cycle of lies, guilt, and violence. The cost of their actions was more than just a man's life, it was the destruction of their family, their community, and their own integrity. This story serves as a powerful reminder that manipulation, no matter how subtle, can have devastating consequences. It shows the dangers of letting one's desires and frustrations fester without addressing them in healthy ways. It also speaks to the importance of communication, trust, and honesty in relationships. When we allow secrets, lies, and manipulation to take root, we risk losing everything that matters: our loved ones, our peace of mind, and our sense of self. As we reflect on Isabella and Carlos's story, we must ask ourselves, how far would we go to get what we want? Are we willing to destroy everything for the sake of our own desires? What happens when manipulation and deceit take over, and how can we recognize the signs before it's too late? These are questions that we should all consider as we navigate our own lives and relationships. The tragedy of the Rivera family is a cautionary tale for us all, a reminder that unchecked desires and manipulation can lead to destruction, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we hold dear. So, what do you think about Isabella's actions and the consequences she faced? Was there any point where you felt sympathy for her, or did she go too far? What lessons do you think can be learned from this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. And if you found this story intriguing, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories and deep dives into the human psyche. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you don't miss our future videos.